In the late summer of 1883, in the high desert cattle country south of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, there was an auction held in the yard of a failed freighting company called Draper and Sons. The yard sat at the edge of a wide, sun-bleached flat, and the heat that afternoon rose off the packed clay in visible waves, so that the crowd of bidders seemed to flicker and dissolve at the edges as they stood among the lots. There were good things at that auction: a string of draft mules, a set of iron-banded freight wagons in serviceable condition, a leather-topped desk taken from the company office. Men in good hats moved among these items with the unhurried confidence of those who had already decided what they wanted and what they would pay. One woman stood apart from the rest. Her name was Nell Pruitt. She was 27 years old, standing 5 feet 4 inches in her boots, with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned not to spend energy on display. She wore a cream floral pioneer dress gone soft with washing and a vivid red shawl that she had folded twice over her shoulders against the wind off the ridge. Her dark auburn hair was pinned at the nape of her neck. At her hip she carried a brown leather satchel that had once belonged to her father, and inside that satchel were the tools of a trade most people had never heard a woman claim. A set of case-hardened lockpicks, a tension wrench, a probe, a hook, and a short raking bar, each wrapped in their own strip of chamois cloth. Nell Pruitt was a locksmith. Her father, Franklin Pruitt, had taught her the trade in the back of his small shop in Cheyenne from the time she was 10 years old until he died of a lung fever when she was 23. He had been a meticulous man, slow to speak and precise in everything he put his hands to, and the understanding he passed on to her was not merely mechanical, it was philosophical. A lock, he had told her many times, is an argument. It says, "This is mine, and you may not enter." To open a lock, honestly, is to answer the argument on its own terms. You learn its language. You do not break it. You do not force it. You listen to what it tells you, and you give it the answer it was waiting for. She had worked in his shop after he died, then worked for a hardware concern in Laramie until the owner decided he did not care to employ a woman in a trade that required her to go alone into the homes and offices of strangers. She had found other work where she could, and for the past 8 months, she had been living on smaller earnings than she would have liked, taking in whatever commissions she could gather from ranchers and merchants who had lost their keys or inherited a locked chest they could not open. She had come to the Draper auction because she heard there was a strong box in one of the lots. That was the word passed through the trading community around Laramie. Draper and Sons had gone under owing money to half the county, and everything was going to the block, including a large iron safe that had been in the company office. A safe with an unknown combination was a thing that usually ended up as dead weight, and dead weight sold cheap. Nell Pruitt had come to bid on dead weight. She had arrived early, before the buyers gathered in any numbers, and she had walked the yard slowly with her satchel at her hip, making her own inventory. The draft mules were good animals, well fed and sound in their legs, but mules were not her business. The iron-banded wagons she examined more carefully, running a hand along the wheel hubs, checking the tongue hardware, noting the way the wheel iron had worn at the inner rim. 2 of the 5 wagons were serviceable. The other 3 had been run hard and rested hard, and showed it in the split wood of the brake blocks and the rust pink staining around the bolt plates. She noted this without particular interest and moved on. The office furniture was stacked near the steps of the main building. The leather-topped desk, a rolling chair with a wheel gone to splinters, a hat stand, and 2 wooden filing cabinets with their drawers removed and stacked separately. She glanced at the cabinets. The locks on the drawers were simple pin-tumbler mechanisms, stamped hardware, the kind a determined child could defeat in an afternoon. They were not why she was here. She had found the safe before the crowd arrived. It was in the back corner of the building's ground floor, visible through an open side door, sitting on a square of pressed clay floor, where it had apparently been too heavy to move until the auction committee arranged the manpower. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a while without going in. It was larger than she had expected. 400 pounds was the figure she had heard, and looking at it now, she thought that figure might be conservative. The body was heavy-gauge iron plate, the seams blind riveted rather than bolted, which was the construction technique Hall and Company had used in their premium line before they switched to a lighter structural method in the early 1880s. The door sat slightly off plumb, which meant either the hinges had relaxed over time or the frame had taken a blow at some point. The combination dial was brass, set slightly askew, and the area around the latch plate was dented as she had heard, the metal compressed inward as if someone had taken a hammer to it in frustration. She understood that impulse. She did not share it. She did not tell anyone what she had seen. She took her place at the edge of the crowd when it gathered and watched the lots move, and she waited. If you have ever stood in a room where something important is about to happen without knowing it, you may understand what the yard of Draper and Sons looked like that afternoon, the crowd thinning toward the edges where the lesser items were roped off. There is a particular quality to things that are about to matter. They do not announce themselves. The safe came up last, moved on a flatbed cart by two men who had spent 10 minutes arguing about how to get it down the office steps. It was a Hall and Company model, square-shouldered, painted black, but gone to mottled gray and brown rust at every seam and corner, with a brass combination dial that had been knocked slightly askew, and a cast-iron handle that someone had at some point struck with enough force to leave a dent in the door beside the latch plate. The auctioneer, a small, brisk man named Cortell, looked at it the way a man looks at a stray dog that has wandered into his yard. He called it worthless junk. He said it plainly with a little theatrical weariness meant to amuse the remaining bidders, most of whom were already turned toward the gate. The combination was unknown. The previous company bookkeeper was not present and reportedly had no interest in cooperating. The thing weighed somewhere north of 400 pounds and would require a team and a sled to move. If anyone wanted it, they could have it. And good luck to them. $3 was the figure he named. Nell Pruitt raised her hand. There was a short silence among the remaining few. A man near the rope chuckled. Cortell looked at her with the polite confusion of a man confronted with something he cannot quite categorize, then brought his mallet down. Done. She paid from a folded envelope in her satchel. She arranged with a man named Burns, who ran a dray service out of town, to come with a flatbed and a team of mules the following morning. She wrote her own name and the address of the rented shed she was using as a workshop on the receipt that Cortell handed her, and she folded it and put it in the satchel alongside her tools. She had one question before she left. She found Cortell at the table where he was tallying the day's accounts, and she asked him quietly and without particular urgency whether there was any record of what the safe had been used for, whether any of the company documents had survived the liquidation proceeding. Cortell told her that most of the records had gone to the claims office in Laramie as part of the receivership filing, but that the safe itself had been in the back corner of the company office for at least 15 years, possibly longer, and that no one had been able to open it in recent memory. The previous office manager, a man named Harker, had left the company 7 years back and apparently taken the combination with him when he went. Whatever was inside had been inside since at least 1876. Nell nodded once and walked back across the sun-baked yard to where her horse was tied. The safe arrived the next morning on Burns's flatbed, wrapped in a cargo blanket that did very little against the dust of the road. She had cleared a space in the shed before dawn, moving her work table to one side and spreading a clean canvas on the floor so that she could work around the thing without kneeling on packed dirt. Burns and his helper unloaded it with a ramp and a great deal of controlled profanity, and when it settled onto the canvas, it made a sound like a note struck on a very large, very patient bell. The two men stood back and looked at it without any particular sentiment, and Burns said he hoped she knew what she was about, and she told him she did, and they left. She circled it for a long time before she touched it. The Hall and Company safe, in the model that had been produced between roughly 1868 and 1881, used a four-wheel combination mechanism behind a single relocker. The combination dial, when functioning correctly, engaged a drive cam and 3 secondary cams in sequence, and if all 4 discs were aligned to their respective notches at once, the bolt work retracted. The challenge with a safe whose combination was unknown was not brute force. It was listening. Her father had shown her the principle on a smaller model when she was 12. You learn the feel of the disc pack through the dial, the faint resistance as each cam comes into alignment with its notch, the fractional difference in tension that tells you the fence is seated. It takes time. It takes a particular quality of attention that most people find difficult to sustain. She spent the first day simply learning the dial. She worked slowly, moving the dial through its positions by quarter turns, her fingertips resting lightly against the brass face, her eyes on the middle distance, listening not with her ears, but with the nerves of her hands. She kept a small ruled notebook and recorded every position where she felt even the suggestion of a change, however faint, in the resistance of the mechanism. By evening, she had filled 3 pages with penciled numbers and had narrowed her working range considerably. She ate cold cornbread and drank 2 cups of coffee at the work table and went back to work by lamplight. It was exacting work in a way that has no good shorthand. Her father had described it once as listening to a conversation in a room with the door closed. You cannot hear the words, but you can hear the shape of them, the rises and stops and the particular silence that means someone is about to speak. What she was learning in those first hours was the shape of this specific mechanism's silence. Hall and Company had not been entirely consistent in their tolerances, he had told her, and no 2 of their 4-wheel safes felt precisely the same, even off the same production line. Each one had its own weight at the dial, its own small variation in cam geometry. You had to learn the one in front of you, not the idea of the model. She went home in the dark, slept 4 hours, and was back at the shed before sunrise. The second day, she worked the tension differently, letting the raking bar rest lighter than her instinct told her to. And by mid-morning, she felt something she had not felt the day before. A slight, clean drop in resistance at position 43, then another at position 71, cleaner than the first. She marked them. She checked them 6 more times across the afternoon, approaching each position from different directions on the dial, ruling out the false gates that a 4-wheel mechanism uses to mislead exactly this kind of search. A false gate feels almost like the real thing, but the quality of the drop is slightly different, slightly too easy, like a step that is just a little too obliging. She had learned the difference by the time she was 14, and the years since had only sharpened the distinction in her hands. By the end of the second day, she had 2 wheels. She was certain enough to write the numbers down in ink rather than pencil. The third day was harder. The third cam was stiff, its notch shallow, and whatever lubricant had been inside the mechanism when the safe was manufactured had long since dried to a powdery residue that created a kind of friction noise through the dial, a murmuring interference that made the faint signals harder to read. She paused at midday and went out into the light for 30 minutes and let her hands rest, walking in a slow circle around the shed, with her eyes on the distance and her fingers loose at her sides. Her father had told her that the hands hear only so much before they go deaf, the same way ears do in a loud room. You rest them, and then you go back. She found the third cam late in the afternoon at position 28, confirmed it twice, and stopped for the day. Her fingers ached from the concentration of effort. She noted that in the ruled notebook as well, not because it mattered to the record, but because it was the truth of the work, and she had a habit of recording the truth of things. The fourth cam took until the afternoon of the fourth day, and when it settled, when all 4 notches aligned and she felt the fence drop and the bolt work begin to move, she stopped and put both hands flat on top of the safe and held them there for a long moment. There is a word for what she felt in that moment, but it is not excitement. It is closer to the feeling of a key turning correctly in a well-made lock, a sense of rightness, of a thing answering its own question. It is not triumph. It is more like recognition. Yes, she thought, that is where it was. She opened the door. The inside of the safe was dry. Whatever sealing compound Hall and Company had used in the door gasket had held well enough over the years to keep the moisture out, and the air that came out when she swung the door back was cool and slightly stale, the way air is when it has been long enclosed in iron. There was no dramatic rush of it, no cold breath of revelation, just a stillness, and then the smell of old paper. She held the lamp up and looked at the interior shelf for a long time before she reached inside. The shelf was cast iron, painted with the same black enamel as the body, and the paint on it was perfect, unscratched, which told her that whatever had been placed inside had been placed there with care and had not been disturbed since. The objects on the shelf were arranged in a row, as if someone had set them down deliberately, in the order they expected to retrieve them. She noted that before she touched anything. The arrangement had the quality of an intention. There were 3 items on the interior shelf. The first was a cloth bag, drawstring tied, laid flat. It was flat, which told her it had been empty for a long time. She lifted it and turned it in the lamplight. The cloth was a heavy canvas, the kind used for currency transport, stiff enough that it had kept its shape across the years, rather than collapsing into a rag. Stenciled on the side in black ink that had faded to a dark gray were the words, Wyoming Territorial Bank, Laramie Branch, and beneath that, a date, August 14th, 1876. She set the bag on the canvas beside her and looked at it for a moment. 7 years. The bag had been inside the safe for 7 years. The second item was a small leather ledger, no larger than a man's palm, its spine cracked but its pages intact. She opened it carefully, working the dried leather spine back without forcing it. The writing inside was small and precise, done in 2 different hands. The first hand wrote in a clean, upright script that filled its lines neatly and without particular haste. Columns of figures, dates, initials in the margins, the kind of entry work done by a man accustomed to keeping accounts. The second hand, which appeared beginning on page 9, was different in character. It was cramped and slightly backward slanting, with the particular habit of running certain letters below the baseline, as if the writer had been taught in a hurry and never quite corrected the tendency. She studied both hands for several minutes before she moved to the third item. The third item was a folded document, larger than the ledger, secured with a wax seal that had dried to powder around the edges and crumbled slightly when she touched it. She unfolded it with care, steadying the paper against the slight tremor that stiff old documents develop when they have been held in one position for years and resist returning to flat. When she had it open, she held the lamp close and read it through once, then read it again. It was a letter on Wyoming Territorial Bank stationery, dated August 12, 1876, 2 days before the date on the canvas bag. It was a transfer authorization for the sum of $6,400 in payroll currency, intended for the Copper Ridge mining camp north of Rawlins. The authorization bore the signature of the bank manager of record at the bottom of the form. Above that signature, in the space marked for the countersignature of the disbursement officer, the cramped, backward slanting hand had written a name: R. Harker. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was in front of her. The 3 items lay on the canvas in the lamplight: the flat canvas bag, the ledger, the authorization letter. The shed was very quiet around her. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub grass at the edge of the road with a sound like a long, careful exhalation. What she held was not merely old paper. What she held was a record of a theft. She spent the next 2 days in the Territorial Records office in Laramie and in the morgue of the Wyoming Weekly Boomerang, where back issues were kept in bound stacks that smelled of dust and slow dissolution. She was methodical about it, beginning with August of 1876 and working forward 3 months. The records office was a low-ceilinged room at the back of the county building, staffed by a thin clerk named Purvis, who wore the same wool coat in all weather and regarded requests for historical materials with the resigned tolerance of a man whose orderly system has been regularly disturbed by people with inconvenient needs. She told him she was researching a property claim and needed any filings related to the Draper and Sons Company from 1876 through 1878. He brought her 2 boxes, set them on a reading table, and left her to it with a brief look that suggested he considered this unlikely to yield anything worth the mess. The filings told the story in pieces, the way records always do. Not as a narrative, but as a series of facts that have been stripped of their context and arranged in alphabetical and chronological order. She found the initial freight transfer receipt from August 1876, which listed the Copper Ridge payroll shipment as received for onward transportation. She found the dispute filing from September, the Draper Company's denial of receipt, the bank's counter-submission, and then a long sequence of procedural correspondence between offices that had clearly all been waiting for one of the other offices to act first. The last entry in the Draper file was a notation made by a clerk in December of 1877 that the matter had been referred to the Territorial Claims Board and was awaiting assignment to a reviewing officer. There was no subsequent entry. The matter had been referred and had simply stopped. The newspaper morgue took longer. The Wyoming Weekly Boomerang had not indexed its back issues with any system she could identify, and she went through the stacks page by page for a solid afternoon, reading the fine print of front-page lead stories and the smaller items buried inside. She found the September 1876 coverage of the Copper Ridge dispute in 2 paragraphs on the 3rd page of the September 22nd issue. A brief account that named the figures involved, but offered no explanation and no resolution. The kind of coverage that appears when an editor knows a story is real, but cannot yet determine what it means. She found 3 more items across October and November of that year. A follow-up notice that the matter was under review by territorial authorities. A single sentence item reporting that the Copper Ridge camp had suspended operations pending settlement of the payroll dispute, and a small advertisement placed by a land surveying company in Denver that was seeking an experienced assistant, signed by a firm she had not heard of. She noted the Denver advertisement without yet knowing why. She came back to it the next morning and understood. What she found confirmed what the documents had already told her in outline. In September of 1876, the Copper Ridge mining camp had reported that a payroll shipment authorized by the Wyoming Territorial Bank had never arrived. $6,400 intended for 231 miners had simply failed to appear. B. The stage company contracted to transport it maintained they had delivered it to the intermediate freight agent, which was Draper and Sons, for the final leg of the route north. Draper and Sons maintained they had never received it. The bank produced its transfer authorization, signed by the manager and countersigned by one R. Harker, the assistant disbursement officer. The dispute went into the territorial claims process and died there, slowly, in the way that institutional disputes die when no one party has the power to compel the others, and all of them have reasons to prefer the matter unresolved. The miners at Copper Ridge had not been paid. Some of them had stayed through the following season on the promise of a settlement that never came. Most had simply left. The camp itself had closed by the spring of 1878. A man named Harker had left Draper and Sons in 1876, within weeks of the dispute being filed. He was not named in the official proceedings. He was not a named defendant. He was simply a man who had countersigned a transfer authorization, and then, quietly and without particular announcement, had gone to work for a land surveying company in Denver. Nell understood the shape of it now. Harker had been in a position of particular usefulness to anyone who wished to intercept a large currency transfer. As the assistant disbursement officer at the bank, he would have known the routing, the amount, the timing, and the name of the freight agent handling the final leg. He had countersigned the transfer authorization, which put his name on the document but also gave him legitimate reason to be in contact with the freight company about delivery details. Draper and Sons would have had no reason to question him. He was the bank's representative. His presence at the freight office was unremarkable. What he had done with the currency after he took it from the transfer was harder to reconstruct precisely. The ledger entries in his hand recorded receipts and disbursements over a period of 4 weeks in late summer of 1876, in figures that did not correspond to any Draper Company transaction she had been able to identify in the records office filings. They were smaller figures, the kind that suggest the movement of currency in portions rather than all at once. $120 here, $240 there, over a span of days. A man being careful. A man who understood that a large amount of currency moved all at once would be noticed, but the same amount moved in smaller pieces across several weeks was simply routine commerce. The canvas bag being empty told her that the currency had been removed before the bag was placed in the safe, or had been removed in the weeks after, before Harker left the company. What the safe had held was not the money itself, but the proof. The authorization letter with his countersignature, the ledger with his entries, and the dated canvas bag that tied the transfer to the date and the bank. She thought about that for a while. A careful man, she concluded, who had nonetheless kept the one thing he should not have kept. Perhaps he had intended to destroy the documents when the investigation cooled and had not found the opportunity. Perhaps he had kept them as a kind of insurance, a record he controlled against the possibility that someone else in the chain might try to place the blame on him. Whatever his reasoning, he had locked the evidence into a company safe, taken the combination with him, and left Laramie. He had apparently trusted that no one would open it. He had not been wrong for 7 years. She brought what she had found to the office of the territorial land claims assessor, a man named Whitfield, who had been in the position long enough to have inherited the original 1876 complaint file. His office was on the 2nd floor of the county building, a room that smelled of paper and lamp oil and the faint mineral scent of a coal stove burning low. She laid the ledger and the letter and the canvas bag on his desk and explained where she had found them and how, speaking plainly and in the order in which events had occurred. Whitfield looked at each item in turn, then looked at her, and then looked at the items again with the expression of a man who has been told something he already half suspected and is now confronted with the obligation of acting on it. He picked up the transfer authorization letter with both hands and held it at an angle to the window light, reading it slowly. He set it down. He opened the ledger and turned the pages to page 9 where the second hand began, and read the first several entries without comment. He asked her where she had obtained the right to open the safe. She placed her receipt from the Draper auction on his desk beside the other items. $3, paid in full to the estate of Draper & Sons, freighters, liquidated. He looked at the receipt for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "The safe and its contents were your legal property." She said they were. She said she had obtained the safe at public auction and had opened it by means of the trade she practiced, and that what was inside was hers by purchase, and that she was delivering these items to his office because their content appeared to pertain to a territorial matter that predated and superseded her own claim to them. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he would need to contact the Wyoming Territorial Bank and the successor institution of the Copper Ridge mining camp, which he understood to have reorganized under a different name in Rawlins. He said it in the measured, careful tone of a man who is beginning the long process of doing something that cannot be undone. Nell told him she would be available to give a full accounting whenever it was required. She gave him her address and her name, and she gathered the items back into her satchel, since they were her property, and she would be returning them in her own time when the formal process required it. The process that followed was not quick, and it was not simple. Institutional claims of this kind rarely are, and the machinery of territorial justice moved with the particular friction of any mechanism that has been rusted shut for years and is being worked open by degrees. There were letters to Denver and responses from Denver, and a period of several weeks during which Nell continued her ordinary work and received no word at all. There was a formal interview conducted by a claims officer sent from the territorial capital at Cheyenne, a thorough and rather humorless man named Goss, who asked her the same questions in 4 different orders and seemed disappointed when her answers did not vary. Goss had a habit of watching her hands while she spoke, which she found neither threatening nor interesting. She answered his questions in the same order and with the same words each time, because the facts had not changed between his first asking and his 4th. She told him what she had bought, what she had paid, what she had found, and how she had found it. She told him the number of days she had worked the dial, and the method she had used, and the notebook she had kept. She produced the notebook. He examined it with the expression of a man looking at a document in a language he does not speak, but suspects may be important. When he asked whether she had made any copies of the items before delivering them to Whitfield, she told him she had transcribed the ledger entries into a second ruled notebook, which she had at home, and that she would make it available to him if required. He wrote this down. He did not ask why she had made the transcription. She had made it because her father had told her never to deliver the only copy of an important document to anyone, and she saw no reason to explain that. What she had found could not be unknown. That was the nature of a document. It persisted. The ledger in Harker's hand, the transfer authorization with his countersignature, the canvas bag with the bank's stenciling still legible enough to read. These things did not require her to argue. They required only that she had found them and that they were genuine, and both of those things were demonstrably true. In the 3rd week of October, a notice appeared in the Wyoming Weekly Boomerang reporting that the Territorial Bank's successor institution had entered into a formal acknowledgment of the 1876 payroll dispute and had agreed to a settlement process with the identified surviving claimants from the Copper Ridge payroll. The notice did not name Nell Pruitt. It did not explain where the new evidence had come from. It was a brief item, 2 paragraphs, the kind of thing that appears in a newspaper when a legal matter has been resolved to the satisfaction of the parties, and no one wishes to draw additional attention to how long the resolution took. There was a man named Abel Thorne who had worked at Copper Ridge in the summer of 1876 He was 53 years old now, living on a small dry goods operation in Rawlins. He had been one of the miners who had stayed for the settlement that never came, had lost a full season's wages in addition to the unpaid payroll, and had never fully recovered the ground. He was one of the 17 surviving claimants the assessor's office had been able to locate. When the notice reached him, the woman at the dry goods counter said that he had read it twice, and then set it face down on the counter and gone out the back door for a while. And when he came back in, he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had put it down. Nell did not meet Abel Thorne. She did not go to Rawlins. The restitution was not her ceremony to attend. She had found the proof. She had delivered it. What happened after that was the business of the people who were owed. There was a conversation she had, in November of that year, with Cortell the auctioneer, who encountered her at the hardware store in Laramie where she was buying a new set of probe files. He had read the notice in the paper and had eventually understood the connection, though it had taken him some time. He looked at her with an expression somewhere between sheepishness and genuine curiosity. He said he had not known, of course, that anything of that kind was inside the safe. She said she hadn't known either. She had known only that a safe was a thing that held what it was given and gave it back to the right hand. He nodded slowly at that, in the way people nod when they are turning a sentence over in their minds to see if it means more than it appears to. Then he said that he supposed $3 had been a fair price, all things considered. She did not answer that. She paid for her files and left. By the following spring, the shed she had been renting was too small for the work she was being offered. Word had moved through the county in the way that it does when a thing has been demonstrated rather than merely claimed, and the people who came to her now came with a different quality of attention. A rancher from the north of the county who had a strongbox from his father's estate that had been locked for 9 years. A merchant in Laramie who needed a new locking system fitted for his storehouse and had heard that she understood mechanisms the way other people understood a familiar language. A territorial land office that needed a cabinet of survey records, rekeyed after the previous lock had been forced and damaged. She found a proper space on a side street off 2nd Avenue, with a front room for clients and a back room for work, and she had a sign made. It said, plainly, N. Pruitt, locksmith. The sign cost more than the safe had, and she did not regret either expenditure. The Hall and Company safe she kept. She had it moved to the back room of the shop, where it served as her own strongbox for the papers and currency she accumulated as her practice grew. She had fitted it with a new combination of her choosing, one she had drilled into the mechanism herself, and the combination was known only to her. The brass dial, bent slightly out of true from whatever blow it had received in the past, she had not bothered to replace. It turned as smoothly as it ever had. A dial does not need to be straight to tell the truth. She worked in that shop for 31 years. She trained 2 apprentices, both of them young women who came to her through the same kind of desperation and intelligence that had brought her to the Draper auction yard, and both of them went on to their own practices in other parts of the territory, and then the state, because Wyoming became a state in 1890, which Nell noted without particular ceremony, and then went back to the work on her bench. She testified twice more in territorial proceedings where locks and their contents were at issue, and in both cases the outcome turned on what the mechanism itself had preserved, rather than on what anyone had said or claimed. She died in Laramie in 1914 at the age of 58, and the notice in the paper called her a respected local tradesperson, and mentioned that she had operated her locksmith shop for more than 3 decades. It didn't mention the Draper auction or the Hall and Company safe or the $6,400 that had been sealed inside it for 7 years before the right hands found the combination. Ask yourself what you would have bid on it that gray afternoon in 1883 if you had been standing in the yard among the lots of dead weight and mule tack and departed enterprise. Whether you would have raised your hand for $3, what you would have needed to know or to believe or to have been taught in order to understand that the thing Cortell dismissed with a wave of his mallet had an answer inside it, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. That is the whole of the question, and Nell Pruitt spent her life answering it. If that question has been sitting with you, leave a word below. It is worth more than $3. The back room of the shop on 2nd Avenue outlasted the building it was inside, which was demolished and rebuilt twice. The safe was moved both times to wherever the new back room happened to be. The last record of it places it in a storage facility in Laramie in 1916, 2 years after Nell's death, listed in an estate inventory as One Iron Safe, Hall & Company, Combination Set, Contents None, Condition Serviceable, Value Uncertain. Uncertain is one way to put it. If you are drawn to stories about things the world was wrong to dismiss, there are others here where the proof was always in the thing no one opened. The door was there. It only needed the right hand.